Yeah. Oh, well, pleasure. Glad you could be here. Yeah, if you could type in the chat, that would be great. So, yeah, I just finished a 3-day event in Austin, Texas, which is where I'm doing where I'm doing this from. And the focus that well, it was 2.5 days, I guess. It was like 90% of it was around how to build a business to exit. And many of you may say, I don't want to sell. Hopefully after this, I might change your perspective. Um, but that's great. All right, so we have people still coming in. We'll get started in a minute here. Yeah, grab a pen or paper. We're going to be going over a lot of material, and I'll repeat this again when we go live. But this material really to give it any real, uh, there's some of these subtopics alone can be like a day or two workshop alone. So the intent behind it is just really give you an overview, and then with certain topics we'll drill down a little bit more. So, all right. Well, I respect everybody's time, so let's go ahead and hit the ground running. Then we'll go from there. Okay, Richard. Yeah, if you could help if you can help people come in as they arrive, that'd be great. But in the meantime, I'll just
Yeah,
get
I'll do
started
that.
here. Cool. All right. So let's see. All right. So just very quickly, Richard, well, you're a co-host, so can everybody see my slide? If you can't, just type in the chat. Just say yes if you can see my slide and hear me. Cool. All right, that's the
Yep, can
case.
hear
Then let's go ahead and get started. All righty. So I want to welcome everybody. Again, my name is Alex. The presentation that we're going to be covering today is how to grow and exit your digital agency and B2B consulting company for 7 figures or more. That's quite a mouthful, and it's also, as some of you may realize, some of you may find that a little bit far-fetched. Others may say, yeah, it's actually something I can see myself doing. Wherever you're at, that's fine, right? So I'm actually going to break this presentation into 2 pieces, and then we'll go to Q&A as well. So just plan on about 45 minutes to an hour, depending on how much interaction we have with the audience here. All right. So really, just want to make sure you're in the right room, as they always say in every, I've actually seen this happen. At first, I thought it was a gag, but somebody actually showed up on the wrong flight. And so I just want to make sure everybody, right? So this is for you if you want to grow the business to sell 7 figures or more. You're ready to exit the business for 7 figures or more, meaning that you're a lot closer, maybe in the next 3 to 6 months, or you're looking at exiting, but you're not quite happy with the sales price yet. The last one is a very advanced strategy. I'll touch on it. If you want to talk further, I'll give you a way to basically book some time with myself. But it's really if you want to massively increase the exit, I'm talking about like maybe not just by a couple 100,000, by several millions or more. And some of this is going to definitely push the boundaries of what some of you may believe is possible. All I ask is you keep an open mind, okay? Topics to be discussed: how to grow using partners. Because I think most of you here, I think at some level understand like there's only so many ways of growing the business. We have a particular preference of a growth strategy, which I'll get to a little bit later here. But there's a ton of resources out there about how to grow using paid ads, funnels, and all that. There's really very little we can contribute to that body of knowledge. So when we help our clients grow, either just to grow, not necessarily exit, but in some cases, some people want to grow for an exit. Our preferred approach is using partners, which I'll get to a little bit here. That's why I have it in parentheses. And then the next question is, some of you may have never even thought about it, is like, well, why do I want to sell an exit? I enjoy running my business, running my company, or it's my baby. And again, I might push back on that a little bit, ask you to take maybe a different perspective on that. What affects the exit price? I just spent the last 2.5 days at a fairly pricey workshop at a mastermind, and a lot of it was around this. Most people have a very, well, how do I put this? Vague idea of what drives the valuation, and some is very counterintuitive, by the way. So I'll just leave it at that. Different types of acquirers. Acquire is just another fancy word of saying somebody that buys your company. The reason I prefer using the word acquire over a buyer, because since if you're like if you're running a services-based company, a lot of time if I'm using the word buyer, it can create confusion and say, well, are you talking about my clients? Or are you talking about the person who's buying my company? So that's why I just distinguish between clients, which is the people that you service, and then the acquirer, which is the person who's going to buy your company. Rarely are you going to, when you talk to somebody like myself, when you talk to me, rarely do I use the word buyer to mean the buyer of your services, because it just muddies up the water very fast, right? So that's why I'm very precise in these terminologies. So if we're going to do this, I just ask you to kind of pick up, use that same terminology as well. And then when you're going to be talking to other people, other than myself in this field, that's the same lingo they're going to use. So you are going to be learning some, some new vocabulary that's predated us by, several decades, right? Some of this goes back 50, 100 years. It may be new to some of us, but the industry has existed long before, many of us have been in it. So share with you some next steps if you want to move forward, and then Q&A. Okay. And again, we have a manageable audience here. So if you have any questions, just feel free to type it into the chat, and Richard will then, interrupt me at the right time. So that way, but some of this stuff, if you went to the end, some of this stuff kind of builds on the previous slide. So if you went to the end, you could easily get stuck on something that then, ends up getting not as clear. So I'm fine with, just taking questions throughout it, but I prefer to do it through chat, because if we have to like unmute something back and forth, it can just kind of drag us down a little bit. So, but yeah, if you have any questions, just feel free to type into the chat. And if you have any specific questions you'd like to make, answer, before we finish, just make sure that you type into the chat, and Richard will queue that up for me as well. Just for the format for the question, if you don't mind typing a capital Q : so that way we know it's a question, because some people come sometime with typing, oh, great, great work and everything. And so it's hard for us when Richard's scanning the chat to see what exactly is a question versus something that's just a commentary. Okay. All righty. So I'll try to keep this mercifully brief. I've been in the industry now for going on 30 plus years. And then I built and sold a B2B agents, a B2B, well, to use my own lingo, a B2B consulting company. And later I'll actually explain why I differentiate between consulting company and agency. And there are significant differences, by the way. Most people that do this on a day-to-day basis, they don't make a distinction when it comes time to sell your company. It is a big difference. And I'll explain exactly what I mean by that. So, if you wanted to, you could just cross out and say, I built and sold a B2B consulting company. It wasn't an agency in today's, lingo. It had blue chip clients. That just basically means household name clients like, Bank of America, IBM, Carnival Cruise Line, things like that. VC stands for venture capital. That basically means that it's people with tons of money. So they basically put in tens of millions of dollars on the company that bought mine. And then they bought me for strategic reasons, which I'll get to what that means later. Became a C-level executive, meaning I became the chief technical officer, and I managed $18 million of revenue. Had about almost 80 people reporting to me. Been involved over $100 million of M&A, which is a fancy word of saying mergers, acquisitions, which is a fancy way of saying buying and selling companies, as an advisor and also as a broker, right? An advisor is somebody that advises you in the process. A broker is the one to actually like make sure the deal gets done. So I just yesterday, one of the folks I was working with got, an offer for, I think, close to $3 million, for example. Clients include 7 to 8 figure agency owners, Inc. 500 CEOs, and investment fund, and also consulting companies. Written, I think at this point, 6 books, including on how to grow, use acquisition, how to exit your company. That's one of my brand Expo agency. Have books on IT management, on marketing. So. And I'm a very big believer in giving back. I've been very fortunate to be in a position where I've helped multiple foundations, charities, nonprofits raise over 450,000. Actually, that number I think is over $500,000 now, for various nonprofits, usually around literacy and entrepreneurship. I also host workshops where, the fee is, instead of charging people the market rate, they make a donation to a charity they support, and then that's the fee. And then when I do, when I help a client exit a business, I allocate a certain amount of money from each exit to basically toward various causes I support at this point in my life, usually in Southeast Asia. All right, so that's a little bit about myself here. And by the way, that is a photo. This is actually a photo I took, and I always jokingly said that's a Photoshop photo. So anyway, so two parts of this presentation, right? The first one's growing the business. And the second one is exiting the business. Now, if you're not interested in selling it, I still would ask you to stick around, because what I find that a lot of people, they have this belief that who's going to buy my business, right? And I always tell folks that every business, it can be sold. Now, it may not be the price you want, but it can be sold. So the question then becomes, if you want to sell it over 7-figure, then you have to have certain things. You have to have certain things in process. And I'll actually get into the reason why people buy companies as well, or I'm sorry, people acquire companies, to use my own vernacular there. Okay. So growing the business, right? There's really, I'm a I follow Jay Abraham. Some of you may have heard the name. He's been around for several decades. He's considered one of the most, deep thinkers around business growth there is. But really, if you want to boil it down, right, there's only a handful of ways to really grow a business. One is you add more in the context of a client-centric business, meaning that you work with predominantly clients. Like this doesn't apply. This applies less if you're running an e-commerce business, right? But if you're doing consulting or agency work, these are pretty common right here. You're going to add more clients. You increase your fees. You're going to reduce the churn, meaning you have to figure out some way of holding on to your clients longer. Otherwise, if you have a client, they come on for a month and then they kind of quit. Well, that doesn't really get you anywhere, right? Because there's a lot of there's client acquisition costs that you got to deal with. So reducing the churn is also something that needs to be done long term. It in itself can be another workshop. So, but that's really what people talk about, like reduce the churn. If it's a little bit more. If it makes a little more sense, you could just basically increase the retention or basically keep your clients longer. It's probably a less, jargon-free way of saying that. And the last one is really increase how much each client spends with you. This gets into what we call client LTV, like CLTV and things like that, which has a massive impact on your evaluation price. Now, as I said, we do, 1 day, 2 day plus workshops alone on just these 4 topics. So in the interest of time, I'm only going to talk about the first one. Because the other 3, there's a lot more dependencies on, if you increase your fee, you have to change your market size. So there's a lot. It's every time you pull on a thread, it kind of pulls on another thread. So the first one really is something that I feel that we could talk about, and it's very actionable. The other 3 requires you to go do a lot of you have to, in order to do that, you have to have a lot of data about your own company. You can't just do it, in a vacuum, right? Like there's a lot of information you have to gather about your own company before you can put together a plan. The first one's a little bit more straightforward, and so I like to kind of share with you a small piece from our playbook of how when we are brought in to help you grow a business. All right. Now, there are a ton of ways to grow a business, right? The most common one that most people gravitate toward is, or they've been preconditioned to do it, mainly because it's so visible, is to use paid ads, which is also the riskiest way to do it, right? Google and Facebook have done a brilliant job of brainwashing all of us to thinking that, the only way to grow is to spend like insane amount of money with them. Well, it makes them rich, right? But they're not exactly out to see. I always tell people this, right? Like Google and the Facebook are not in the business of growing our business. They're in the business of hitting our credit card, right? Whether you make money or not, they don't care. So it's it's a very lopsided, relationship, right? You can call it that. So instead, what I prefer doing is finding out what I call strategic partners, sometimes called joint ventures. Okay, so I'm going to give you maybe 4 or 5 different ways that we help our clients grow. You can call this organic. You can call this, there's different words for it. But the point is that there's no paid advertising involved. You can supplement it with paid advertising, but it's not. It can be done completely without paid advertising. Okay. Here. Okay. So kind of share with you a little bit here. Now, when I use the word partner in this context, what I mean is who already has your clientele or your future clients, right? Like they're already expending a lot of resources, money, time, energy, credibility, or whatever, and they already have a sizable following. And when I mean sizable, I don't mean like necessarily 10 million followers Instagram, right? By the way, if you're going to partner with somebody who's got 10 million Instagram followers, odds are it's probably not a good fit for you anyway, because I suspect most of you are not selling to the masses, right? Most of you are probably selling to a niche of some form. So podcast host is a very, very often overlooked channel. Now, why is this important? Well, there's a mass proliferation of podcast hosts right now, and it's growing by the month. And here's why this is very important. A podcast host has a tremendous amount of trust and influence over the audience. If you think about what a podcast host has to be able to do, they have to have enough credibility with the listener for the listener to listen to them 45 minutes to an hour. If you put it in context, there's been science, there's been many studies that's been done over the last 10 or 15 years. The average attention span right now of an adult in the US is less than that of a goldfish. A goldfish has an attention span of 9 seconds. The average adult right now in the US has an attention span of 7 seconds. That tells you how distracted we are. So to get somebody to listen to you for 45 minutes says something, right? So what that means is if you could build a relationship with a podcast host, and there's a way to do it, so that you build a trust and that they feel that you can deliver value to their audience, they will gladly put you in front of their audience, because one of the biggest jobs that a podcast host has to do is they have to bring on, qualified, interesting, guest experts to their audience, right? So if you know how to approach them, they will be happy to have you on the show. I've spoken on podcast hosts, with only a couple of thousand listeners, and it resulted in a lot of money because it was the right audience, right? I always tell people, do you want to get in front of the million wrong people or 100 the right people? And by the way, it's not a trick question. Most people think it's a trick question. It's not, right? If I get in front of if I go on Instagram, again, nothing against Instagram, but that's not really where my audience is per se. And I joint venture with somebody who's got 10 million followers, but they're all people that has no interest in what I do. I haven't accomplished anything. But if I go on a podcast host of somebody that, I'm going to a podcast host next week, right? They don't have a couple thousand listeners, but almost all the listeners there, the vast majority of them are there for a very specific topic, how to sell your company. So that to me is infinitely more valuable than, trying to connect with somebody who's got, 5, 10 million, followers on Instagram or Facebook, or whatever. So podcast host is a very often overlooked partner opportunity. And when it's done properly, I know at least four people that's built their business. One sold their business almost 8-figure. And the main thing that they did was actually getting a lot of podcast shows. So that's often overlooked one right there, right? And there's a again, depending on what niche you're in, you could have dozens or in some cases hundreds of potential podcast hosts that you can contact. And this is something that we do on behalf of our client, as part of our playbook. The other one are promotional partners. So a lot of folks have I would call it Facebook groups or email lists or whatnot, and they like promoting somebody, another service provider, because they don't do that. So I'll give you a very good example, and I've done this many times, with Richard, and also on my own. If you find somebody that's a complementary service provider, right? If you find somebody that basically is doing something that you don't do, but their clientele needs it, then they will gladly have you promote you to their list, have you speak at their event or something similar, mainly because to them, it's a way for them to provide additional value to their audience, because they don't do that, right? So for example, I've spoken on multiple stages, virtual and physical, for folks that have, that service agencies and masterminds. Agencies and consulting companies, because they don't do what I do, which is showing people how to grow and exit the company, because they may just focus on the growing part, but they don't focus on exit, or vice versa. Event hosts are really, really good as well. Event hosts, I would say, is probably the deep end of the pool. I would say that probably start with the podcast host. Unless you have just a tremendous amount of speaking experience, most event hosts are reluctant to put you on their stage unless you've already have a significant track record, or you have a skill or a topic that it's fairly hard to source, right? That's one advantage that I have, because the topic I have was very niche. Not most people are qualified to talk about it. So if there's an event out there that needs somebody to talk about it, I'm on that short list of speakers. So one thing I would ask all of you to do is just kind of think through, broaden what you know, and then at the same time narrow. What do I mean by that? Well, if I'm extremely myopic in my background, right, I can say, well, I only speak on selling a company. Okay, well, that's fine. But what else have I done? Well, I've also bought companies. That's a different topic, right? Acquiring a company is slightly on the flip side, selling a company. But I've also taken a company to 7-figure, which statistically only 3% of companies ever get to, right? I've also written 5 or 6 books. So there's a number of topics I could talk about if I want to choose to. That's what I mean when I say go narrow, or don't paint your life experience down like this narrow field right here. Okay? Because a lot of time, if you're too narrow, you're going to wipe out, a lot of speaking opportunities or podcast hosts, right? And then likewise, but if you're but then at the same time, I can also go narrow as well. You see, because if I know they already have a lot of speakers at a lineup, I say, well, all those are talking about growing a business, but I'm the only one that knows how to talk about selling a business. Now, well, you're right, you're now category of 1. You see, so this is the thing that you want to kind of do as an exercise, right? Write down the things that you've had experience with, and also you personally lived through. By the way, a lot of you I found, especially working with consulting companies and agencies, they massively discount their corporate experience. So I worked with Richard for years, right? And I only knew what we were working on together. And one day he said, "Well, I was actually the director of e-commerce at a major airline." I'm like, well, like, okay, I've been working with you for like 5 years. The first time I've heard of it, what was that like? Oh yeah, well, we're the first airline in our country to actually, offer, online reservation. Well, that's actually pretty cool because that means you're ahead of the curve, right? You somewhere in your corporate experience, you worked on some stuff that was ahead of the curve. So that's what I'm talking about. A lot of folks somehow when they go into business for themselves, somehow they completely ignore the fact that they spent 20 years, in corporate America doing amazing stuff. That's why I made the reference earlier about I used to manage almost $18 million of revenue. That was from my corporate experience. So these are things that you want to kind of flesh out if you're going to work with your partners, right? Because they want different. A lot of times these partners, they want, especially with speaking, they want different perspectives as well. This last one is very, very important, and it's a very it's something that I also seen that that once you really quote unquote get it, it's really powerful, which is finding complementary providers. So I'll give you something very specific from my side of the business that helps people sell their company, right? The brokerage side. We have a lot of our relationships with business coaches, and also a lot with with not financial advisors, but like CFOs and people like that, chief financial officers, because those folks, a lot of time, they have the confidence of their clients, and they're sometimes one of the first person a business owner talks about thinking about selling their business. So we have a lot of opportunities that come from business coaches, business mentors, people that handle the financial side of a business. You see, so you're an agency, you may want to talk to like companies that handle the bookkeeping for agencies, right? They are out there. You see, likewise, you may want to talk to you may want to talk to people that put on events that have your target audience. If your target audience are small business owners, then find a coach or a mentor or somebody who's got a community of that. That could be an owner of a Facebook group. It could be an owner of a YouTube channel, similar things. Those are often overlooked channels right there. Okay, so those are, like I said, we have an entire playbook about this when we help our clients want to grow, and they may not want to exit, but they want to add, what we call, to their growing their top line, which is their their sales, right? Any questions about this? Like, so this is one slide, but it's when you unpack it. Like I've actually done a 2-day class on this alone. Showing people how to just, find strategic partners, how do you make yourself, compelling to a partner to promote you to their audience, whatnot. Cool. Okay, that's part one. So now let's kind of shift the second to part two, which is exiting the business, because that was the promise of the event, which is how to grow, and then if you want to also exit. This is a client of mine here. He runs what's called a white label Google agency, meaning that they provide and they sell they provide Google advertising services to other agencies that don't have Google expertise in-house, right? That's what it's called, white label. Anyway, I helped him sell the company, and he was happy with the experience. So this is just a testimonial. He then used the funds for this to go then launch another company, which I'll get to in a second here. All right, so here's some key lessons, okay? We're all, I think, past, we're not, as I say, in high school anymore, right? As I tell people, right, you're going to exit whether you like it or not. The only question is, are you going to be proactive or reactive? Right now, I just came back. I just got the latest data from from this event I'm at. Right now, there's 3,800 businesses that close the door every day in the U.S. That's just in the U.S., by the way. So that's most people's exit strategies. They shut the business down, which is really tragic because a lot of times it's their life's work, right? So, and I'll get to this later, this is going to be the biggest financial decision you can make in your life. It's not going to be your kids' college education. It's unless you live in like some $20 million penthouse in Manhattan, it's going to be bigger than the sale of your house. Most people the saying, it's going to be, house is the biggest financial decision of your life. That should be a consumer. If you're your biggest owner, the sale of your business is going to dwarf that. Again, unless you happen to live in, some $20 million, penthouse in New York somewhere. But just kind of keep that in mind, okay? So this is something you really want to think through. Statistically, for most small business owner, anywhere between 60 to 90% of their net worth is tied up in their business. So this is something that, it really has to be planned out, right? I find that most people spend more time thinking about how to get the next client than about this. And this could dwarf anything else you're going to do. This is the equivalent of like 100 client sales right here, if you want to put it in perspective, right? And again, you most likely have one exit in your career, and a single mistake could cost you hundreds of thousands or even millions, right? On my first exit, made a mistake, cost me $400,000 of cash. And that's after me having spending tens of thousands of dollars of legal fees, a CPA firm, and everything. These things are just not talked about, right? And those folks, just so you know, they're there for compliance reasons. They're not advisors, okay? And it's not a criticism of that profession. That's what they went to school for compliance. They're not there to help you think outside the box because they could lose their license, okay? Why sell? As I already said, right? It's the biggest exit, it's the biggest financial decision you can make in your life. And here's the thing that really I did not realize until about 5-7 years ago. You're almost always going to make more money from selling your business than you ever were running it. It's a fact. It's backed by thousands to tens of thousands of data points. Okay, statistically, the odds you getting where you want to go financially by running your business is slim to none. Again, I hate, this is what I was saying before, right? I really don't believe in sugarcoating this stuff, especially when there's less money on the line. There's going to be people out there, oh, well, you run, you take this business, you set aside, say 10, 20%, say, yeah, and then what happened when the stock market crashed by 80%? Okay, well, just watch a lot of your life's work just kind of evaporate. So this has to be planned out. Okay? And then this last bullet is fairly advanced. I'll just kind of touch on it, but I won't belabor it. It's also, if you do it right, it's also, you're going to keep most of it. It's not about what you make, it's what you keep. And when you structure it properly, at least in the US, there are ways to defer a significant amount of that sales price, through cap gains, which is different than normal income. This is something I want to touch on because most people are not aware of this as well. When I talk to folks, I talk to agency owners, who want to sell in a given month, I don't know, maybe 15, probably on the low end 15, maybe on the high end, maybe 20, 25 of them. And I find a lot of this is really not, it's not something that's really known, for lack of a better word. There's really two types of acquire. Most of the time, the majority of the deals that happen are going to be what I call financial buyers. These are folks that really run and buy the business based upon using, what's called multiple, which I'll get to in a second. Meaning it's a multiple of your adjusted net profit. A more fancy way of saying it is it's a multiple of what's called your SDE or EBITDA, which I'll get to a little bit later. But the point is, they're buying your business predominantly as a return on cash flow. Nothing more, nothing less. If you want to boil down all of M&A into less than 50 words, that's it right there. They're buying your company for no other reason than it's a return on cash investment. Yes, there's the emotional reason, all that. But at the end of the day, the numbers don't make sense. It's not going to happen. Right? Just as you would never go buy, overpay for a house. Well, some people do because of emotional reason. But if you invest in a house versus buying for your residence, unless you just want to be completely reckless, there's a certain price above where it makes no sense to buy the house because you're never going to make it back. Right? So that's why I mean when I say it's a financial buyer. They have to be that objective. Otherwise, we're talking about very large sums of money here. A single mistake is not $10,000. It could be several hundred thousand, several million. So they have to have checks and balances, right? That's one of the reasons why they do what they do. The second one is a little bit not as well known as what we call a strategic buyer. This is one where your capabilities can then help them achieve something they can't do on their own. Now, this is not a tangent. This is where the idea between an agency and a B2B consulting company makes a huge difference, okay? I have yet to see or know of a strategic buyer for an agency, because an agency predominantly is a cash flow. A B2B consulting company has a lot more intellectual property, usually like a proprietary process. Okay, I'll give you an example. I'll give you two. one very extreme, so it drives the point home. There's a company right now that I'm working with doing well under 7 figures. They only have 4 clients, and they're all Fortune 20 clients. And I asked them, so what's your secret sauce, right? So I just got to the point, like they said, well, we have a proprietary process that lets people win big proposals. They call RFPs. To go from like proposal to a client win 65% of the time. Now, you've ever been in the consulting world, that is an astronomically high number. You're lucky to get 20-25%. That's if you're damn good. 65% is unheard of. If a company were to buy them based on their current cash flow, they're not going to get squat because it's just not that big of a company. But a big consulting company that typically loses tens of millions of dollars of business because they don't know how to go from proposal to a close, they're going to pay whatever money it takes to get that company, because in their hand, that process is worth tens of millions of dollars conservatively. Do most of you understand what I just said? They don't care how big that company is. They couldn't care less what the profit is. They care about that proprietary process that consulting company has. Okay, this is why I make a distinction between agencies and B2B consulting company. Let me use me as an example. One company wanted to buy me for the cash flow. At the time, we were basically overspending on talent because it was a talent war. We had almost no profit. It was embarrassingly low, right? I mean, like we were doing, mid 7 figure, but you look at our net profit, it's laughably low. The company that bought mine, the variance between this and this was over 1,000%. This company couldn't care less what my staff was. They couldn't care less what my client list was. They, quite honestly, they didn't care what my profit was, as anemic as it was. They care about the fact that I had a process to do software development a certain way, because without it, they kept losing multi-million-dollar projects. So they paid my company for the fact that it gave them new capabilities that they cannot have, that they just flat out don't have. That's costing them money. This is why Google paid YouTube $1 billion. They couldn't care less what YouTube's revenue was at the time, because it gave them a capability that just flat out did not have. So to sum this up, a B2B consulting company, the right one, can be almost positioned as a quasi software company. And all the benefits of it. Software companies, some of the reason they're worth so much is because of the proprietary knowledge that's inside the software. So that's why, what I'll get to a little bit later, if you want to drive up the valuation of your business dramatically, think more like a B2B consulting company, think less like an agency. An agency says, oh, how many more clients do I have? At some point, it's diminishing return. But if you could actually create a proprietary process that in the hands of a bigger buyer makes them a lot of money, you can almost name your own price. I have one company right now that came to us. Their net profit, if you were to do it as a multiple, at most be worth 7 million, 8 million. They just turned out an offer for $120 million. They want us to help them get a sales price close to 180 million. A financial buyer would probably pay them at most 7, but they just turned out an offer for 120. Now, again, that's an extreme case, but I'm trying to drive the point home, right? So that's why, this is why, strategic buyers, you don't just stumble across a strategic buyer. You got to think through who they are and everything. Fortunately for me, when I built my first company, I kind of had a loose idea what it was. I had an advisor. We kind of sharpened that focus of who that strategic buyer was, and that's who we sold to, as a strategic buyer. Like I said, we got paid roughly 8, maybe 10 times more than the highest offer from a financial buyer. Okay, increasing exit price. This is, again, for those of you that are looking doing this. By the way, you don't want to be figuring this out 3 months from from your sales. You want to be doing this a year or 2 ahead of time. So the number one thing advice I would give all of you is this: you need to do this long before you're ready to exit. There's only so much you can do between 3 to 6 months. In fact, I actually had a client recently. I had to deal with a bad news. That if you came to me a year ago, I probably could have gotten you extra $1 million. But because you want to exit the next 90 days, next 190 days, we have to kind of sell it as is. I mean, there's only, as I jokingly call it, right, there's only so many ways you can put lipstick on a pig. I mean, at some point, it's still going to be a pig, right? I mean, you can dress up where you want. You can put a dress on, you can put a hat on, but it's still a pig, right? It's far better to actually start it off with, maybe like something a little bit more attractive, like maybe a cat, if you're into cats, right? But at some point, there's only so much you can dress up the business. So that's why you want to do some of this stuff ahead of time. That's the number one. That's the number one thing I can ask all of you to do right now. Okay, is really think this through and start on this process long. By the way, the other expensive mistake I hear is, "Oh, I still enjoy running the business. I'll sell it when when I'm when I don't enjoy it as much." It's too late. You've already cost yourself $500,000 conservatively. It's way too late at that point. All right. So, all right. So the exit price, meaning the sales price, is based on underlying word adjusted net profit, also known as SDE. I'm not gonna get cats are the best, make a business like a cat. Exit price is based on adjusted net profit, also known as SDE, which is a fancy way of saying seller discretionary earning. I'm not gonna get to EBITDA because quite honestly, for most of us on the call, it's really not that useful anyway. It's a more common term, but it's actually a misnomer for companies of this size. If you want to keep it simple, just think of it this way. SDE is net profit plus add backs, including owner salary, right? The joke I have is this, is, like most business owners optimize their business for tax reduction, right? Oh yeah, I just had one of the business I'm in the process of selling here. They had just an unbelievable 2022, and they're facing this giant tax bill. And then somehow magically, they needed this $120,000 truck. I mean, I don't know. I mean, they're an agency, right? Of course they need a $120,000 truck. I mean, it's come on, right? They did that to reduce their tax bill. But the good news is when you actually sell the business, that can be added back. That's why we never use the raw net profit. We go through this process called recasting, which means you take these add backs and you add it back to the adjusted net profit. That's why you always you never hear me talk about net profit. I always talk about adjusted net profit because it's grossly inaccurate to say net profit. Because every business owner, I mean, we all do it, right? We figure out some way of basically reducing our tax basis. But then when you sell, you got to unwind out and out. The good news is your SDE is never going to be lower than your net profit. It's always higher because you're adding back stuff, right? I mean, we know dentists that somehow that $100,000 pool is somehow necessary for running that dental practice. Hey, whatever, right? But of course it's not, but that's why we go through this process. By the way, if you go ask your CPA this, again, nothing against most CPAs, they're not gonna have a clue what this is. This is not a tax term. This is a finance term. This is the mistake that I told you I made several years ago. I talked to my CPA, they have no clue what this is. In fact, they will fight you tooth and nail about this. Oh, this is illegal. You're not changing your tax return. This is a process that's accepted in the M&A world, in the merger acquisition world, the exit world, whatever. It's common practice. In fact, they don't do it. You really want to question if they know what they're doing. Okay? Usually when I try to figure out if they actually know what they're doing, I ask them this, so what's your SDE? Or net profit is this? And that wasn't my question. What's your SDE? And they kind of have a baffled look. Okay, I got to meet them where they're at. You see, so this is kind of where I talk about a little bit. You can't avoid some of these lingo because it's just common, it's what's needed to understand this whole thing. Anyway, the whole point of SD is it allows them to basically see what the real cash flow and capability of the business is. It allows them to say, hey, if I'm going to spend $2 million on this thing, on a building, I can get this much cash flow. If I spend on your business, I get a certain amount of cash flow, right? That's what it does. It normalizes the data so they compare your business against different asset classes. By the way, every investor is going to do that, right? There's nothing against you or your business, whatever. It's just a way for them to deploy capital. That's what I mean when I said their objective. Yeah, they're going to, some of them, many of them will want to step in and run the business, but it has to make financial sense. So depending on your SDE size, the SDE is multiplied by multiple, usually 2 to 4x. For most of you on the call, that's probably 95% accurate. There may be some exception, but I would say that more often than not, that's the case right there. So here's the napkin math. Right? If you want to boil down, 3 years of an MBA and $100,000 of education at some business B school about around merger acquisition, it's going to boil down to this. SD is 300,000. Okay, that may mean your net profit is 200,000. You wrote off, you spent 25,000 bucks on a mastermind. You spent 20,000 bucks on, I don't know, like decoration that's somehow integral to the business. You add that back in. You have $50,000 on a one-time purchase of something that you don't need, again, right? So 200,000 plus 100,000 add back, we'll get the 300,000 SDE. So the sales price on this, more often than not, it's going to be some close version of this, right? It's 300,000 times 2x, 600,000 and 750,000, give or take. Now, some of you say, well, that doesn't sound that attractive, Alex. That's a lump. Most of that is come as a lump sum. Okay, there's a massive difference between making $200,000 over 12 months and getting a check for most of that in one lump sum. If you ever hear about anybody's had a massive, like, jump in their lifestyle, it's because of an exit. Guaranteed. Well, I guess well, you can inherit it, but that's a different type of exit. It's probably a little bit more morbid. But this is hopefully something that's a little bit less morbid than the other type of exit, right? This is why when you hear about people having like massive jumps in their net worth, lifestyle, and whatnot, it's this. There's no other way to do it. You can save all you want, but it's the time is against you, right? The only way you can leapfrog this is to do this. And the guys on Wall Street, they do this and with several more zeros. This is all they do full time. They don't try to run businesses. If your SDE can get to 800,000, significantly larger business, this is where the magic happens. Okay, your SDE now is more close, going to be 2.5 to 3x. I don't know if most of you just caught what I just said right there. It's non-linear. This is the magic right here that happens. Okay, we're taking a larger amount and we're multiplying by a larger amount. So by definition, it's not a linear growth. Because here's why. It is harder to get a business to, to get to 800,000 SDE. So therefore, you should be rewarded for that. Money is all about risk management. Okay, so because there's significantly more risk when the company is smaller, because losing a couple of one or two key employees or one or two key accounts, the whole business implodes, it's higher risks. Therefore, it's not worth this much.
Alex, just note the sales price should be 800,000, not 300 on that row.
I'm sorry, my bad. Yeah.
That's all. No one's confused about it.
Yeah. This is So this, okay. Let me do this here so it's correct. Okay, so this is my bad. All right. Okay, so this will be more like yeah. Sorry about that. Okay. And so this is why, this slight bump right here, you can see, right? It creates this almost like this, it doesn't do kind of the straight line. It does almost like this weird, almost like, I wouldn't call it hockey stick, but significantly faster growth. And there are people that do this all day long as a profession. They don't run companies. They do this right here, and they hire people to run the company. And that's the transition you make from an operator to an investor. Now you can be both, but you need to know how to view your business through the lens of an investor, right? So, and if you follow Robert Kiyosaki at all, he's got this thing called quadrant: employee, business owner, and investor. This is what he's talking about. Okay. All right. Now, this is what I was alluding to a bit earlier, because I know that we have two different audiences, and some people say, well, I don't understand what's the difference. Why do you make such a huge distinction? This is why. Dollar for dollar, if you're the same size, my personal experience and the folks I talk with, and I talk with a lot of folks about this, a consulting company at the same SDE as an agency is usually valued at 50% or more. So play out what I just said right there. If you can increase the SDE and you can become more like a consulting company or be viewed as a consulting company, what have you just done? It's not 1 + 1 anymore, right? Remember, these are multiplicative effects. They're not additional effects. The most you catch what I just said. Let's take this as an extreme example, right? I have an agency at 300,000. I have a consulting company at 800,000. Okay, the agency is worth 600 to 750. The consulting company on the high end can be worth roughly 4.5x of 800,000. At this point now, it's worth almost 6 times the former. Do most of you catch what I just said? Consulting companies almost always are valued more. And by the way, you can't just become a consulting company because, well, I don't want to be an agent. I just want to become a consulting company. It's not about just kind of like, changing the name on your door title. Okay, you have to make structural changes. But if you know this, you might want to start like, change your company more. Like, hey, well, what are elements of consulting company, right? The joke is like, if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, then it's a duck, right? So be a business, your financials look more like the agency. It doesn't matter what you call yourself. You're still an agency. But if you have more elements of a consulting company, at least you could have a hybrid multiple. And this is one of the things we help some of our clients do when they talk about, well, I just don't want to grow the top line. I actually want to change the multiple, right? So,
can I ask a question?
If you could type it out, Gina, we'll take it.
I'm driving. Okay. I'm driving. That's okay. Thank you. That's okay.
Well, go ahead. No, Gina, go ahead. I wasn't aware you were driving, so.
I have a couple of questions, but I'll ask it towards the end. What does SDE stand for?
We covered this a little bit here. It stands for seller discretionary earning. It's basically the net profit plus the add backs. Things that are one-time or exceptional expenses.
Can you repeat that again? You talk so fast. I'm not understanding what you're saying. What is it called?
So let's just say that you have a net profit of 200,000, right? Just an example. Okay. But then you wrote up a lot of stuff that's not recurring. For example, you basically paid a one-time fee to a business consultant, right? Because you were stuck with something. You paid him $15,000 or her $15,000, right? But you don't expect that again to be incurred next year. You're allowed to add back that $15,000 to the business, so that way your net profit, your SDE, is now not 200,000. It's 200,000 plus 15,000. Okay. Likewise, if you wrote off something, even though it's kind of marginally business related because you want to lower your tax bill, that's why I said earlier about, like, we've actually seen dental practices actually write up $100,000 pool, somehow actually claim it as a business expense. To a buyer, you're allowed to add that back in because they can pretty much figure out that you don't need a pool to run a dental practice or a software company or an agency for that matter. Because most business owners run their business with the intent of saving taxes. So they write off everything possible. When you're about to sell the company, you're allowed to take all those things you write off for tax deduction back to the net profit. I don't know if that clarifies it or not. If not, we can, yeah, so. Okay, we'll have some more questions there at the end, so. But anyway, this last one right here, again, it's fairly advanced, but I at least want to kind of leave you here as a train of something. Is consulting companies usually have more IP and can be more valuable to a strategic buyer. You're far more likely to be able to sell to a strategic buyer if your company is more of a consulting company. By consulting, I mean, like, you could be a leadership company, you could be a sales training company or something like that, versus, I run Google ads, I run Facebook ads, I do SEO. I've rarely seen those get sold to a strategic buyer. I've seen sales company get sold to a strategic buyer. I've seen leadership training companies sell to a strategic buyer. I've seen IT consulting company get sold to a strategic buyer, but I've rarely seen agencies get sold to a strategic buyer. And again, if you're not a consulting company, just ignore that last bullet, because we had a mix of audience here, so I want to at least cater to that, because I've had people ask me, what's the difference between the two? That's it right there. It's not in the operational what you do day to day as much as how you're valued by an acquirer. Like I said, I know this is going fast. Like I said, we normally this thing's covered over several days, but I at least want to give you kind of broad strokes to kind of get you a sense of, like, what we're talking about. Because I think most people conceptually understand how to grow a business, but what I find is that there's a lot of misconception that can be very detrimental financially when it comes to selling a business. And that's really why, I want to kind of paint it too, because when you know how to grow a business and do it predictably, that can also help increase the sales price, the exit price as well. Because one of the things that an acquirer pays for is predictability. So, all right. Again, like I said, very quickly here, growing the business will increase its exit price because, again, it's a function of its adjusted net profit. An exit is often the biggest financial decision in your entire life. And being very direct here, being unprepared, it's going to cost you hundreds of thousands, maybe millions on your exit. I know in my case, it cost, close to $500,000. I had a ton of advisors. So for those of you interested in exploring this further, again, not necessarily just exit, but how to grow your business, predominantly, especially if you want to use partners, I would welcome, since you're here, I would just let you, I would encourage you to book this call. We have this domain called bookexitcall.com. It's a 30-minute call. I haven't done, one-on-one consulting in a long time, but the last time I did it, I charged $2,000 an hour. And so that's where the $1,000 value comes from. And by the way, this is not some thinly disguised sales pitch. I mean, we're going to ask you some very specific questions, and you have to be okay with giving me real numbers. Otherwise, it's always going to be very theoretical, right? So if you come in with a hypothetical number, I'm going to give you back hypothetical scenarios. I'm not working with real numbers. So if you're comfortable giving me, like, oh, this is, or range, right? My company's doing this kind of range. I could give you a range. But this is not some generic script-driven thing. You're going to be talking to me personally, and I'm just going to ask you some, very direct question about what are you trying to accomplish, what are you trying to do, what's your timeline, what's the number you're trying to hit, and I'll just reverse engineer and say this is kind of like some option you may want to pursue. Let's see, you have some questions in the chat here. Yeah, again, it's at bookexitcall.com. Yeah, and it goes right into my calendar. So, okay. So then we have some, time here, about maybe 10 minutes for Q&A. Oops, that's just interesting. And so we kind of go with that. So let me, okay, I have John here. Oh, go ahead, John. Don't know how to lower, I think you're unmuted.
I got it.
Yeah.
I got it. Got it. Amazing content, Alex. I'm curious, like, if you're going to engineer this process, like if you're going to build a business to sell, is there any tips you have on, like, firstly, you said like you have probably like a 12-month, 12 months seems like an optimal, if you've got a business to turn, like, how do you turn a pig into a cat? Is that, it's 12 months? Are you better off trying to turn a pig into a cat, or build a cat from scratch?
Right. Well, if you build it from scratch,
question.
it's definitely going to take more than 12 months. But if you're doing where you at least have some momentum, I would say probably 12 to 24 months is, again, it depends on the exit, right? Most of the thing here, I'm not talking about like 100,000. I mean, that's not a trivial amount of money, but I suspect for most people here after taxes, it's not going to like make that huge material difference in lifestyle, right? That's usually why I tell people it's usually for around $1 million, right? So if you have time to do that, let's just say, 12 to 18 months, I would say that the number one thing you want to do is figure out how to massively increase your client lifetime value. And what I mean by that, well, your client lifetime value is how much is the client worth to you. And why is that important? Well, because that's a very strong, what's the word I'm looking for here? Asset. Because here's what it implies. That means that you have to have high fees. Well, how can you command high fees? Well, you better know what you're doing. You also have to know who to sell to. You also have to know how to articulate a very strong value proposition. So a high client value can only be achieved by all these other stuff, right? Like when you hear somebody can run a 4-minute mile, what does that imply? They're pretty damn good shape is what it implies. But what does it take to get that level of fitness? Well, you have to know your nutrition. You have to have a good sleeping habit. You probably don't have a drinking habit. I don't know too many runners that can operate that level and have a drinking habit, because it's going to destroy your physiology. So there's all these things that implies, you see? So in the world that I operate in, more often than not, what you want to do is get to a client LTV in the 5-figure, around 15,000 or so. By the way, that's not trivial to engineer. Most Facebook ad agencies that I talk to can't even hit half that. Because if you're only charging like $1,000 or $1,500 a month, and you want to get to $15,000, that means you better know how to hold down a client for 10 months. Most Facebook agencies I know of, and I know a lot of them, and I've seen their financials, can't even hit that. You see? So that's right there is one thing you want to focus on, is the LTV. Because what does that imply? It also implies that not only do you know how to land them, you have to deliver sufficiently high quality service that you can retain them. You see, this is a mistake that everybody makes, right? Because one of my mentors is a gentleman named Dan Kennedy. Again, he's not for everybody, but very smart man. He has a saying that says, a dollar's a dollar. That is true when you're running the business. It is not true when you're looking at selling the business. Understand what I just said. Okay? When you're running the business, you really couldn't care less unless the money was from a legal source, immoral, whatever, right? You really couldn't care less. Once the check clears, you're done. That is not true if you think about selling the business. Okay? There's a massive difference between a business that's 200,000 SDE with insane churn, meaning you have clients, new clients every 2 or 3 months, okay? Versus that same company that has half the amount of clients, but they keep their clients 3 times as long. Every buyer is going to line up to buy the second company and throw a premium at it, because it is far harder and far more rare to find a second client. Anybody can go out and land new clients. It is far harder to retain them. Because at the end of the day, that's what's going to increase their margins over time, right? Because remember, the most expensive thing in a business is acquiring a new customer. So you're constantly acquiring a new customer. What do we know? That price is going to keep on going up and up and up and up, which means your margins over time are going to drop and drop and drop and drop. Versus if you retain them, you've incurred the client acquisition once, and you retain them month after month after month. That means that your net profit is compounding. And if you remember what I said earlier, your sales price is a function of your adjusted net profit. That means that your profit over time is going to grow. In fact, that's the only way it's going to grow. So that one metric almost drives everything else. It drives your fees. It drives who you sell to. It drives your retention. It drives your client selection. It drives what kind of onboarding you have, what kind of ongoing customer service you have, and everything. I've had many buyers just pass on a business entirely, mainly because LTV is too low. Because as soon as they see that, they say, well, what's your customer acquisition cost? They do like 30-second math, not interested. Because they know the moment they put that money in, within 3 years, that money is mostly going to be, they can't recoup it. Because the only way you can recoup the money is the money continues to grow, right? But if money's losing value every year, then how the heck are they ever going to get their money back? So that's what I would focus on.
Genius. Thank you.
Yeah, most people talk about getting to recurring income. That's a given, right? Because you're an agency. Most people are doing, recurring. If you don't have it, then definitely do that. But then the other thing that's driving anything beneath it, it drives all economics, is client retain value. So, I'm sorry, client lifetime value. So, yeah. So again, folks, the link that you want to book is bookexitcall.com. And again, if you're not ready to exit, that's perfectly fine. We'll still show you how to work with partners, or at least help you identify, give you some tips on how to identify strategic partners that you can leverage. Because the great thing about strategic partners is when it's done right, your customer acquisition cost can go down dramatically. And also, not only is your customer acquisition less, but because you've been heavily endorsed by the host, when it's done right, it tends to shrink the sales cycle, but it also tends to lead to more loyal client, which is back to what I was saying earlier about the increase your LTV, right? The longer they stay, the higher your client lifetime value. I really didn't appreciate why that was so important until I actually got into helping people sell their business. Because in the past, it's just some kind of like ethereal, abstract number. Okay, client lifetime, whatever, right? It's a J. Abraham thing. But the moment you start looking at selling your business, it becomes hugely important. Hopefully, you realize that, long before you're at the negotiation table. So, any other questions from the audience? Rich, I can't see the hand being raised, so you'll have to help me if there's anybody. So
Yeah, I don't see any questions coming in the chat either.
Okay, yeah. So like I said, the SDE thing, I was trying to simplify, but but you oversimplify it and becomes inaccurate. But if you want to think about it this way, when you're selling a business, a CPA that's trained on how to sell a business, right? At least is aware of it. They're going to take that. They're going to do this thing called add backs, and then they're going to use a multiple on your SDE. And if you talk to somebody like me, hey Jeremiah, do you have a okay? Cool. By the way, if you're not following this gentleman, you need to. This is a very smart man right here.
Well, I have to say, Alex is probably the most intelligent man I've ever met, and extremely handsome after that comment. Alex, can you give us some feedback on SDE versus EBITDA and your thoughts on the two and everything else in between?
Sure. So I've rarely seen EBITDA really used with companies under 3 million. So since I know, not know, but I suspect most of the people are probably running business below that. So I typically use the SDE versus the EBITDA number. And even at this mastermind I'm at in Austin, there were some, you would think that this thing's been around for like 50 some years, right? It'd be like really universal acceptance, but there's still like some, some room for like, how you interpret some of these things. So probably the biggest difference between SDE and EBITDA is where do you put the owner's salary, right? With an EBITDA calculation, the salary is part of the overhead. Meaning that even you're paying yourself a salary, they know that you're probably not going to be around. So if you don't pay yourself a salary and you didn't back that out, they're going to add, like, in other words, if you're right now running the business, but the buyer is not interested in running the business, they're going to then suddenly insert in a line item to the spreadsheet that said, oh, what's the market rate for that position? And then they're going to apply a different multiple to it. So that's probably one comment I would make on that. Like I said, the SDE is usually used for like companies that are like what we call owner operated, meaning that people that are still running the business. And it's actually usually that numbers are like 2 or 3 million. We just did a deal. Just got help someone get LOI here on a business. I think it's like doing like 2.3, 2.4. And it's kind of marginal because he was only there. They were only like maybe 5-10 hours a week. But they still paid themselves as though they were full time. And so the buyer made an argument saying, well, like we're gonna have to hire somebody. Say, oh, yeah, I mean, there's already a line item in there for that, right? So.
Absolutely. Thanks for that. Great feedback.
No problem. We have a couple 1 or 2 minutes left. If you have any question, and please type it in here. But also, you're welcome to book a call at bookexitcall.com. We want just on one URL, so we could figure out is it book, exit, and grow the call. It just got too cumbersome, so we just for succinctness, we decided to call it bookexitcall.com. But we could just talk about, because if you're going to sell, you want to sell while the company's growing, right? So you have, you always want to be focused on growth, even if you are selling. A lot of people say, well, I'm going to sell the company, I could just kind of coast. No, that's the worst thing you can do is when you're looking at selling is coast. You just destroyed any chance of getting a good price for it. So
You should share what happened with your lawyer, with all the lawyers and everything. You had the mistake of not asking. You didn't ask that.
Yeah. Yeah. There's definitely, there's a category of knowledge I call like things you don't know that is very expensive after the fact. So that was my $400,000 lesson. So, Stephen, yeah, I saw you raise your hand. Yeah, hi.
I've enjoyed your webinar here. Thanks for sharing.
Oh, no problem.